Welcome to .Connect Africa's Web Forum. We hosted our fourth Crisis Management Conversation series under the campaign theme Your Say, Your Part on governance and human rights in the era of COVID-19. This forum was hosted and co-moderated by Sophia Bekele, Chair of the Web Forum and founder and CEO of DCA Group, and moderated by Dr. Chaloka Beyani, Professor of International Law, London School of Economics. Our panel of speakers discussed creation of new policies that are overbroad in reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic that might harm the pledge to respect human rights, ensuring the continued equal treatment and non-discrimination right to health, promoting the right to information, enhancing the protection of privacy in the age of use of contact tracing tools using artificial intelligence, machine learning, among other tools, gender considerations, especially how women and girls bear the greatest weight in managing the pandemic, way forward, practical measures, and using COVID-19 as an accelerant to positive change. I will hand over to Sophia Bekele, who will take it from here.
Hello everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever, and my co-hosts are also in Kenya. My name is Sophia Bekele and I'm your host and co-moderator today from the .Connect Africa Group. Welcome to our virtual forum. As always, you guys are friends of Africa, so I appreciate you coming. You're coming live via tech, and this has come the new way of the world. I know we're tired of virtual meetings nowadays, but it is what it is. So thank you for making the time and gracing us with your presence for this forum. Our session today is governance and human rights during the era of COVID-19, and it is part of our crisis management conversation series under our hashtag campaign Your Say Your Part. So why DCA chose to hold this conversation is no mystery. I was speaking with my friend Chaloka Beyani, who is serving us today as the main moderator. And we were talking casually what was happening around the world regarding how governments were handling the pandemic, like everybody does, and so forth. And he expertly was speaking on it. And I asked him, why don't we do a conversation piece, bring experts around, see what other views are. And he effortlessly agreed. So we are here today. So I started my curiosity and preparation on this subject actually to help the debate of what we're doing from a YouTube clip that was worthy of sharing and sort of makes it an introduction for us in deliberating the issue. So I'll share a screen so we could do like a 2 minutes of that. I thought this would sort of get us started.
Since the coronavirus was first identified in Wuhan in December, Chinese authorities have punished doctors for raising the alarm, detained citizen journalists for reporting on the epidemic, and removed social media posts critical of the government's handling of the crisis. Governments should respect the rights to freedom of expression and access to information.
Human Rights Watch has a track record of documenting violations of older people's human rights. With the coronavirus outbreak, we will be vigilant in monitoring to ensure governments put their rights at the center of their responses and do not undermine them.
COVID-19 is a risk to women's rights. Women make up the majority of healthcare, social service, and domestic workers, and are on the front lines of this disease. Authorities should take steps to reduce harm to women and girls and ensure that responses do not perpetuate gender inequity.
More than 1 billion young people have been affected by the school closures worldwide. There can be a disproportionate effect on at-risk children, like those with disabilities, refugees, and those from very low-income families. Governments need to ensure these young people are especially supported right now.
Millions of refugees live in close proximity in unsanitary, overcrowded refugee camps and detention centers. Rational, evidence-based measures to protect public health are not in conflict with the right to seek asylum, but rejecting asylum seekers at borders and sending them back to places where their lives are threatened is.
Lockdowns may be necessary to slow the spread of COVID-19, but limits on freedom of movement should never be imposed in an arbitrary or discriminatory way. Authorities should impose restrictions for the least amount of time necessary and provide support for people who are left alone or trapped in abusive situations.
So basically, it's sort of a powerful message, especially for governments. You know, the big question is, can global governance survive the COVID-19 pandemic? In a nutshell, the messaging seems to be, while making policies and mitigation measures, many national governments and organizations have taken harsh and unprecedented measures against its citizens, and by extension, migrants, refugees, and other displaced persons. So these include, but not limited to, total border closures, quarantines, expulsions, and lockdowns as we know it, and also including on work communities and refugee camps. So some of the actions taken to control and prevent the spread of the virus have also been more harmful than good. So what the human rights groups seem to be saying is, it is imperative that procedures to manage this extensive harm exacerbated by the pandemic must be consistent and in tandem with established international human rights norms. So these norms also include the health information, due process, and non-return to risks of serious harm and non-discrimination, and thus apply equitable to all persons, irrespective of their immigration status. So now let me introduce the esteemed speakers. I also could share that from my desk here, which is easier. But first of all, of course, our moderator. I have to say that the panelists and the moderators' accolades and credentials are long and impressive. So please apologize for my abbreviations in the interest of time. So our main moderator, Dr. Chaloka Beyani, is an associate professor of international law and law department of the London School of Economics. And he's a member of the SG experts groups of experts. I like that. To the high-level panel of internal displacement, former chair of UN Special Human Rights Procedures and former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights of internally displaced persons. He studied law at the University of Oxford and University of Zambia. He has taught international law, human rights, public law, and criminal law at Oxford. So all I know is he lives and breathes this and world of human rights, and he had to be at this forum, so he is.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. Not necessary.
Thank you for honoring us with that. And I think I met you a few years back, and in London, and we through a good friend, and we start talking about Africa and justice all the time. So I'm glad you're here. And then there is Mr. Ivan Smonari, partner and head of the dispute resolution practice at Bowman's Law. I think it's a Pan-African firm or international. Ivan, you'll tell us. But he's also chair of publicly listed companies, local and international charities, and he resides in Kenya. He's a skilled international lawyer. He never loses an argument. He had handled various international criminal cases and won, so be aware. Aside from all his long-standing professional career as a lawyer, Evans is a great friend in need and a man who stands for justice. So we are very honored to have you here. So I will move on to Mr. Gregory Simskin, Senior Advisor at USAID, former Staff Director for U.S. House Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organization, USA. First and foremost, today is Mr. Simskin's wedding anniversary. I congratulate you. I won't date you by asking how long you were married, but I know you saw the confirmation date late, but you still came. Thank you, Greg. You're a stand-up guy. DCA is honored to have you, your say and your part in this campaign against the pandemic. Your work in Africa is exemplary. Among other work you do in Capital here, we know you're famously known for helping the original Africa Growth and Opportunity Act and subsequent revisions to gain passage. You may know Africa as much as we do. So I met Greg through a mutual friend during the Obama tenure when I was lobbying in US Congress for one of my high profile causes, which have mercy on me, I have many of them. So a good person to know for some of you if you are lobbying for your high profile clients in Washington. All right, so Sophia Bekele, I hope you have your last name right.
Letapan.
It's Letapan, how lovely. Usually the way you say it. So Sophia is a namesake here. Sophia is a young and rising lawyer who has passion for fighting for women's rights. Her practice has expanded beyond Kenya, garnering expertise on human rights advocacy and litigation within the African human rights system, while contributing to African feminist and legal discourse. One of her notable publications is a training manual on litigating before the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which includes a feminist critique of the communication concerning women's rights that have been determined at the African Commission. Wow. So she's passionate about addressing sexual harassment and dismantling the patriarchy that fuels it. Amen, Sophia. She is also the creator and host of a Dear Law podcast. Has utilized storytelling, feminist, and survivor-centered approaches to bring forth the sexual harassment experience of women in the legal profession and the prevalence of sexual harassment in the workplace. Always good to hear how these young people get their voices out on IGTV, YouTube, and so forth. Anything to be heard, right? So bravo, we are following you. And I think I was introduced to you, Sophia, through a friend in Kenya. You were on your way to South Africa. I believe you're pursuing a master's in law in sexual and reproductive rights in Africa, which is at the Center of Human Rights, University Pretoria. All right. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you. So moving on to Julius. Is a barrister in London. I love the word barrister. We call ourselves lawyers here in USA. Specializing in litigation and alternative dispute resolution in the UK and Cameroon. He focuses on international arbitration and is a relentless activist, as far as I know, for growth and development of Africa. Julius is a great supporter of our cause as well. He's done some work for us, excellent work, and I'm happy you're here. He is also a member of Appeals and Sanctions Board of the African Development Bank Group, the chairman of the Cameroon Business Council, and vice chairperson and qualities officer of the finance and legal branch of Union in United Kingdom, the biggest trade union in Europe. So you have a lot of activities, Julius, and you have recently published an article on ADR, methods for dispute resolution during the COVID-19, which I'm sure you'll share some of your thoughts on that. We want to hear. And Rael was the last person that was going to be introduced. She runs a social protection agency, and she has a lot of activities in Africa, but unfortunately she's not going to grace us today because, as I said before, her mother had a stroke, so too bad she won't join us. So I think I saw Camilla Ismail join us. She's the co-founder of London Sch political party, and she's a politician, activist, media presenter, a TV anchor in Egypt and Europe. She's worked. Her work and accolades are also endless, but she mixes politics and activism to get results. Camilla is a renowned TV anchor who spent most of her career working in mainstream national television, but now turned into a digital media with a promise of bringing their voices to the public without the mediation of establishment media. We will see a short film she produced later on COVID and human rights, which I thought was relevant to our topic today. Camilla is a friend who I'm honored to know for a few years now and whose work I admire. I met her, I should say you were moderating our panel at one of the global forums in Europe somewhere. So that's for the panel. Now I will hand the questioning to the able hand of our main moderator, Dr. Chaloka, and I will follow his hard act as an alternative co-moderator. There you are.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm sure you have noticed that I'm a very soft act and not a hard one, but only DCA has the convening power to get together such a distinguished group of individuals, to participate in this event. So that we very much appreciate. So it goes without saying that the first issue that we have to raise goes to Gregory Simskin on the issue of governance. From where you sit through the lens of USAID, what's your assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on governance systems in Africa? And I think the question arises because people have needed their government so much, and the state has become more relevant than ever in the period of COVID. But obviously, there's also an impact here, to be assessed. So I turn over to Sophia to raise a similar related issue.
Well, in answer to your question, African governments have been praised for stepping up quickly in efforts to fight COVID-19, but they almost immediately encountered opposition from citizens who either didn't trust what the government recommended for disease avoidance or preferred not to follow the directives for one reason or another, often cultural. This was also the case that we encountered during the Ebola crisis. Several weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal reported violent incidents across the continent as governments attempted to enforce efforts to prevent or minimize the spread of the virus. Early on in South Africa, 3 people were killed as police attacked crowds with whips and rubber bullets for defying the lockdown. And 5 more were killed in Kenya, including a 13-year-old boy hit by a stray bullet fired by police, enforcing a stay-at-home order. In Nairobi, in Uganda, soldiers shot and injured people for riding on a motorbike during a curfew. This government violence has only increased enmity among citizens toward their government. It existed before, and this situation is not making it any easier. People are losing money from stores being closed, from transportation being shut down. So if we can't have some abatement of the disease, and if some of these stringent policies are followed as rigorously as they have been, it's only going to make matters much worse moving forward and make governance in Africa that much more difficult. That's how I'm looking at it now.
Thank you very much. Sophia, would you like to come up with a related issue?
So I think, and similarly with the pandemic, many governments have also taken the harsh measure, including the US, right, where there has been a difference in operations between the federal and the state. So what's your opinion on that, on the opportunities and the misalignments as regard to this human rights issue? Greg.
Well, there has, of course, been some harsh treatment from police forces, military forces on the continent, as they have occasionally here as well, as we know. I mean, part of the reason we're in the Black Lives Matters era now is because of police brutality. But you mentioned the United States and how the United States handles these things in Africa. There's an anomaly here that I don't know if people are looking at. And this is particularly at the local level, not so much at the national level in the United States. And comparing that to how African governments have handled human rights, that's in the arena of religious worship. When you take into consideration the willingness of Africans to allow for the closure of churches, mosques, and informal religious gatherings, things could have been more contentious if Africans had truly resisted the closure of houses of worship, because the weekly worship percentage in Africa is much higher in Africa than in the United States. Nigeria, it's 89%, Uganda, 82%, and Egypt, 62%. Houses of worship in the United States, for the most part, willingly shut down services in person, relying to the extent possible on video outreach. My church has done this. Although some churches have defied stay-at-home orders or limits on the numbers of gatherers, and some fought closure orders in court, this forced some U.S. jurisdictions to take police action to break up religious gatherings, which has caused a lot of hard feelings and may have a residual bad feeling among citizens here in various locations. And it's ironic because the Pew Research Center reports that in the United States, the percentage of people who attend weekly services is approximately 36%. So you see, it's sometimes better to be lucky than good. Generally speaking, African police departments, and I'm sure those of us who have been across the continent have seen this. I know I've seen police break up onlookers to accidents brutally. I was involved in it wasn't really a demonstration. We were trying to do some training in Thika in Kenya, and the police responded brutally. So it does happen, but in the case of the religious houses of worship, they were lucky because the parishioners did not respond as they have responded in some places in the United States. So that's fortunate because the human rights situation could be much, much worse.
Interesting.
Well, thank you very much about that, Gregory. I think, two main points I think you underscore. The first perhaps is COVID has exposed a deficit in trust between the citizens and the governments and states. And the other is COVID has, perhaps because of the politicization of the COVID response by politicians, it has elicited the brutal coercive apparatus of the state and governments through action by police on citizens. So we'll put those issues in the parking lot and may come back later. We now turn to Evans Munare, and Evans is someone I've known ever since we met in Oxford. I can't remember how many years ago, some 30-something years now. But clearly you have a very distinguished practice. Evans, you handle very high-profile criminal law cases, no less than your intrusion into the ICC a few years ago, which is the pinnacle of international criminal jurisdiction. But as you do so, what is your perspective on the conduct of the police? This is a theme that already Gregory has touched on in relation to the enforcement of the curfew in Kenya, especially in the early days of attempting to contain COVID. You saw people perhaps bundled in buildings until in the morning. There were videos of truck drivers perhaps being assaulted because they exceeded the curfew limits. Your perspective on these issues, I think, will help us in understanding this issue of governance, COVID, citizens, and criminal justice.
Thank you for those very kind words. We've been having this pandemic situation in Kenya now for almost 6 months, and we've seen it evolve. Initially, the security reacted to this problem as if it was a security issue rather than a health issue, a science issue which required to be looked at scientifically and to be handled in that manner. Since it was not, more people were hurt, and you've had explanations on that people actually died. Many were maimed. Many have been caught up and put in quarantine or in isolation centers. And in these isolation centers, we've seen videos of people entertaining themselves. There have been more infections sometimes in these centers because it was treated as a security issue. In Kenya, when you get into a restaurant or into a public area, the it's not a nurse or anybody who checks your temperature to try and resolve what you're with. It is actually a guard at the door, which is in itself very confusing, because what will they do if they found out that something is unusual? And I do not know any single incident where by checking temperatures, somebody raised an alarm and something was done about it. Many cases have been found either at border points while checking, the actual checking, not just temperature, but the actual testing, by tracing, or by individuals themselves going to health facilities to be checked. So we have not really put up a serious sort of program to ensure that while obeying democracy, the people's health is held as a fundamental issue. Now, if you take into consideration in Eastleigh and in Old Town in Mombasa, where the spread went very high and very quickly, it's because people don't trust their government. If the people they trust are their religious leaders, and they feel that the presence of security forces is a chance to defy government, because they feel that they are being subjugated. So if government in Kenya had taken the initiative to speak to the elders at Old Town, the Muslim elders, and the ones at Eastleigh in Nairobi, then the people on the ground would have understood that we are facing a serious problem here. Here in Kenya, instead of having medical trainees or university students assist in the testing, because because we don't have enough capacity in terms of doctors and nurses, our universities were closed on the same day as kindergartens, and they've not been open to date. And these young people are idle. The economy is being destroyed, and it's going to be there are dire consequences. Then regionally, we've never had a collective response to the pandemic, so that you're as good as your neighbor in terms of taking care of yourself with all the protocols that have been put in place. So if Kenya is going to close its borders, and Tanzania does not, then Kenya is really doing nothing. While you want to have a sort of a granular, lower level reaction and control of the pandemic, it's important to ensure that there's a regional approach to some of these issues, because these diseases, the virus do not have boundaries. Right now, there is a wild migration from Kenya into Tanzania, and the tourists are on both sides of the border. And really, if you go to the parks, animals have they don't know where they belong. They just go up and down the two countries. There was a knee-jerk reaction that has now put us in a situation where even the testing that we do is just for telling the trends. It is not for prevention. And so the daily reports are not being listened to anymore. These are, the daily ministerial reports. People instead wait for the monthly presidential address to see whether the economy is being opened up or not. They really don't care about numbers anymore. All they want to do is conduct the economic activities. And people are now, in fact, you'll be shocked that people are saying, we can live with this thing, so let's just get on with it. And that's where we have not been able to put up a connection between what people want, the science of this issue, and the economics around it.
Thank you very much, Evans. Madam Co-Moderator?
Yes, that's very interesting listening to Evans. Pretty shocking in Kenya. I'm sure other parts of Africa are experiencing similar. But how about on businesses, Evans? Particularly, obviously would Delhi affect previous business contracts and agreements. How is a typical dispute resolution practice changed to accommodate this? What do you say about that? And also maybe the legal fraternity, is it the way of working? Is it going to change as a result? So that's two questions in one.
In terms of COVID-19, there's been a silver lining in terms of the virtual courtroom in Kenya. It is not perfect. We've tried to get digital for the last 20 years, and it failed. But in it failed, didn't work. But in the last 5 months, we are now able to join Zoom calls, team calls, and conduct simple litigation or arbitration issues from home. And most people are embracing that the process. Milimani Court had cases of COVID. This is our High Court, and it was closed, and now it forced us to get into the virtual hearings. But I can assure you, we still don't have a solution for actual cross-examination of witnesses. Science has to come up with a methodology that allows the courts to listen to cases and ensure that justice is done. But we did make a leap in terms of virtual hearings in court. I actually sit at my desk in the morning from 9:30 and sometimes don't stand until evening, because the virtual courts on some days are one after the other, and I don't have to travel to different towns. It is efficient for the client. I can do everything from Nairobi and get the results that clients want. If we improve that system, it can help us because of its efficiency. It doesn't encourage lateness into court by judicial officers or advocates. So there's something going on there that is positive and to be encouraged. Sophia, your other question, a declared dispute is a problem to all the parties, and until it ends, commercial activities cannot continue. And so we've seen a situation where some of the judges who understand that these disputes must be resolved quickly are hearing matters quickly. And that's what I say, that there is a silver lining with regard to dispute resolution in Kenya and the virtual hearings. The challenges we have is that these technologies are not available throughout the country. The resources are not available to all lawyers to participate. And I think that is where government and or the law society should concentrate to ensure that these computers and the technology is made available to courts, not just outside Nairobi, but there are places in Nairobi that require a lot of intervention, especially those who practice in the magistrates' courts, which is where the basic commercial work or human rights work in terms of criminal work will be going on.
Thank you, Evans. Just a very quick recap of the main points that you have made. Essentially, the securitization of the COVID response rather than as a public health issue led by science as well as the scientists. The disjunction between democracy and upholding public health. And of course, the right to health is a human rights issue. And that has affected also other human rights issues like the right to education. And especially, for the young ones, primary education is compulsory under international human rights law. And I think you've also highlighted the role of faith leaders as possible interlocutors between their followers and the government to instill confidence in relation to the measures that are being taken. And of course, the issue of economic well-being and survival of people at the expense of COVID measures, that people are now more interested in living their lives, sustaining their well-being, as it were. And of course, on the courts, what has not worked for so many years, COVID has inspired utilization, easy communication, making, I think, the legal system, the judicial system more user-friendly, demystifying the courtroom appearance that kind of intimidates people. But when they appear wherever they are from, they see the lawyers on Zoom. Perhaps that also points to clearly a legal system that is user-friendly and efficient, as you point out, but still challenged by scientific methods in terms of actual hearings and processes. I now turn over to Sophia to lead us into the next discussion, perhaps with a video.
Okay, yes. This is reintroducing Ms. Camilla Ismail, the co-founder of Al-Dastur political party and TV anchor. So I've seen the full version of the clip of her film, I should say, and we have posted it on the main website. The program is the first of its kind to be produced in Arabic, but paving the way regionally for the concept of a personal TV. It's a concept also won first place in NBC Hope competition in Dubai in 2017 for the best documentary work empowering women in society. It's very, very fascinating. Let me share a screen first, right?
You know, Sophia, maybe I can just send the link over later on. Yeah.
Okay. It's posted on the website, the full version anyway. So,
Okay.
So then I'll stop the share.
Yeah. I mean, in the beginning, I'd like to thank you very much for having me in my capacity as an African for the first time in one of the African gatherings. You know, for different reasons, it looks like Egyptians are not always considered as Africans, or maybe we tend to forget sometimes that we are really Africans. So I'm very happy that today I am here in my capacity as an African, and thanks to Sophia and thanks to the website and to the other guests. Just talking very quickly about this, the concept. Amid this crisis where you know, any government, any regime during crises would like to tighten its grip more, would like and tend to have and to strengthen its position on the ground during crisis. And this is exactly what happened during the COVID pandemic, whereby most of the governments realized that all of the regimes from the authoritarian to the democratic have actually failed to handle this crisis. Represented by the health institutions in different countries. In Egypt, for instance, the Egyptian government tried to have control over the medical equipment, the PCR analysis, the CT scans in hospitals, the media, all sort of information, all sort of knowledge, experience, and so forth. In the States, for instance, we had this battle that started with, you know, wearing the mask, to who is responsible for the deaths of 1,000 people a day. During all of this situation whereby there is a crisis, there is a big trauma, everyone is still trying to process this trauma. We're still in the middle of the trauma. I think we haven't actually moved to the real post-COVID impact, which will definitely come about in the upcoming few months and then will last for quite a long time. So in the middle of this trauma, you know, either the governments or the people, you know, the media, the medical teams, everyone is trying to find their own spaces and their own roles. So in my capacity as a media person, we decided in Medina Portal, the platform which I run my program on, we decided that we should start dealing, you know, sensitively with the COVID-19 issue, try to avoid the censorship and the type of control that the government is having on this issue. So, you know, looking at the original fears that would start from looking at yourself in the mirror as a middle or mid-50s, you know, human being or a woman, you know, realizing that you look a bit different, you know, your muscles are not as strong as they were.
We have lost you.
Realize that. Oh, so am I still there?
You're still there. Your bandwidth is saying you're running low, but it's okay. We're managing.
Oh. Okay, so, you know, the tensions, disappearances, all of the things that you originally live in this part of the world, whereby if you go back to remember, you will never think of implementing or achieving this hope of normalize. You know, we're always saying, you know, we want to go back to normal. We want to normalize. We want to go back to our normal lives, but our normal lives, they have also a lot of fears and a lot of sources for fear.
Thank you, Camilla. That you covered almost all the questions we have actually, Chaloka, I think.
Yes,
If
yes,
you
they're
have
covered.
another one, she spoke very well on that, and you're doing amazing work on the ground, of course, with the alternative media and showing off with the number of population there is in Egypt. So we can move on to the next guest, Chaloka, maybe?
This is your namesake, Sophia. So we have two Sophias here. Sophia Leiterpan. Thank you very much. Obviously, you're a managing partner in a very distinguished law firm. You had some experience as a prosecutor as well. But perhaps your main line of work in the context of COVID and human rights has been the issue of women's human rights and their protection. And COVID has had a particular impact on this, particularly domestic violence across the board. It's not just in Africa, it's in Europe, it's in the US, it's in Latin America as well. So how do we reduce this and provide for support for the affected, considering the medical restrictions that are in place, access to people who are in hospitals, and in particular reproductive health care, for women in the context of COVID?
Thank you so much to my namesake who invited me to come into this forum today. I really like the discussions that have taken place, and I just want to add a little bit with regard to the context of violence against women and girls. And I'll put girls into this mix because we know women and girls are disproportionately affected by violence generally. But what COVID-19 has done is really expose the magnitude of structural inequalities. And so we begin to ask ourselves and try and find out what is the effect of some of these measures that the government is putting in place. So, of course, with the lockdowns and with stay-at-home orders, many women and girls would be trapped with their abusers. And then it has sort of a knock-on effect in terms of their lives. So we've seen increased incidences of different forms of sexual and gender-based violence: incest, defilement, rape, intimate partner violence. So there's been such a huge increase in women and girls being exposed to this kind of violence. And also just remembering that our infrastructure is not necessarily equipped to generally deal with sexual and gender-based violence, even in times of peace, even if we're not dealing with a global pandemic. And what this pandemic has done is sort of just exacerbate that. And I want to sort of link into some of the comments that my senior, Mr. Monari, had pointed out, issues of access to justice. So you can imagine with a lockdown, you're not only unable to seek help, you cannot go to the police station, you cannot access courts, you cannot access medical treatment. So really, even as the Director of Public Prosecutions and even the judiciary, this is an initiative led by the Chief Justice to expedite cases of sexual and gender-based violence. Really, expediting those cases might not necessarily yield a positive result in terms of justice for these women and girls. The other thing that I also wanted to point out, Mr. Beyani, you talked about kids not being in school, and not only is it a violation to their right to education, we also see increased incidences of FGM, for example. So ordinarily, FGM it's illegal in Kenya, but it would ordinarily take place during school holidays, and now it's like free for all. Right? And there are no mechanisms in place to ensure that women and girls are not forcefully undertaken through this ritual and this practice that is still very embedded in our communities. So we find that across the board, from the national government to the county government, you ask ourselves whether devolution is working. Mr. Beyani, I know you can have some reflections on that. I don't know if we should blame you. Are you partly to blame for devolution not working? So this is the issue about this devolved system of government, and we need our governments more now. And so and now we're in this sort of political debates about sharing of revenue, and a lot of the functions that people need on the ground are functions that are to be implemented by the county governments. And so now we have this tussle of war in the Senate on this revenue sharing formula. And the impact is that women and girls still cannot access justice. Providers on the ground not only only unable to respond to COVID-19, but they can't even, their salaries are not being paid. So if you look at the infrastructure, the personnel, the different measures that have been put by the government, really in many instances exacerbate the level of violations. So in terms of some of the ideas to move forward, we have been trying to, as you know, I'm an activist, so I'm a lawyer in private practice, but I'm an activist as well. And we're trying to put in measures to hold the government accountable for its funds, funds that have been received from World Bank, from IMF, and other donors. How much of this money is really going to where it is needed for the women and girls who need to access services, access justice, and so on. One other thing that Mr. Monari pointed out is that, you know, as we're digitizing, that's something that is a reality perhaps in Nairobi, and perhaps only in one major courtroom. But in most of the courtrooms, the magistrates' courts, the lower courts, that these matters would be determined, they're still dealing with COVID outbreaks, causing the courts to be closed. We still don't know whether or not the government is really thinking through measures that can ensure that women and girls have access to justice.
Thank you very much. May I turn over to my co-moderator?
Well, that was well put and said, Sophia. The only thing I may want to add, and I think the same discussion that Monari has brought, is the issue of digitization, which I would love to see as a technologist. And it's very interesting because here, even in the US, where I'm following up court cases, they are starting to do some digitization in court hearings. Superior courts, I think, were granted somehow preference or something. But I've been involved in court cases to find really it's compared to other sectors of the economy, it's extremely archaic in terms of the management of paperwork, as well as, you know, it's just the legal system automation is just behind than many of the industries that I know. And I always had commented on that. But aside from the relying on the government now in Kenya, for example, as both speak about, are there organizations like NGOs or any other organizations that are using technology to access these vulnerable communities that women and other migrants, whoever considered vulnerable in this regard?
Right. We're believers in state accountability, so we always push for, you know, it is the responsibility of the state to put in, you know, to put these measures in place. But there are a few efforts that are being undertaken by different civil society organizations. For example, providing counseling for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence online or over the phone. There's only one safe house in the entire country. Only one domestic violence safe house in the entire country. So this is a gap that some civil society organizations are trying to fill. But again, where do we take these women? Where do they go? There really isn't no standard national guideline or policy on how we actually ensure that these women and girls have, you know, access to safe houses and access to medical care, access to legal aid. So all the measures that need to be put in place in order to ensure that they receive some sort of justice are few and far between. The other thing that has happened with COVID-19 is donor funding is being diverted to the state. So if those kind of resources are now moving from civil society organizations and they're being directed to the government, then that means that civil society organizations who would ordinarily provide some, you know, supportive care or services actually do not have access to those resources anymore. So in the same way that you see businesses and private entities closing, that is the same fate that is being faced by civil society organizations as well. They don't have the ability to even offer these services to women and girls.
Thank you very much, Sophia.
Well, thank you for the points you have made. I think the main issue here is we see human rights as being applicable against the state, and yet COVID has brought the centralized cohesive structures of the state. But we think less of human rights as a social movement, a social phenomenon that applies within the family against structures of authority. And the family where the abusers are inherently an authority within the family should clearly be held accountable. in the context of human rights. And it's quite sad that FGM cases have clearly opened up the space, whereas the school is an avenue for the girls to go to and, you know, come back later. So the opportunities that have arisen on the revenue, the county system, well, I hold my hand up, but it was a demand by Kenyans to have devolution. I think the main point I can make is the fault lines lay in the choice of the system of government. And maybe as you go back to the BBI and the BBI revisits these issues, you know, the impasse that you have is the formula was adopted from federal systems, although Kenya is not a federal system, but the relationship between the counties and the national government is very close. And so the revenue sharing formula and the finance chapter is clearly inherited from there. And you see in the US, sometimes government is at the risk of shutting down because there's a dispute between, you know, the two houses in terms of agreeing the budget or sharing the revenue. But you don't find those in parliamentary systems of government. And if you do switch to a parliamentary system of government, there may be ways of overcoming those issues. But I think that's a discussion for another day when we have a drink. And my dear friend Evans, I saw him smile on that question.
No, that
meaning
that
he has some opinions, but towards the end, I'm sure. Evans, do you want to throw your barb before we go ahead on this issue?
Our revenue allocation, as you are rightfully saying, is because of the mongrel that we created of our constitution.
Yeah.
And the last minute changes that we made without considering what other innovative issues that we had come with. But I don't want to take us there today.
That's okay. I'm glad you agree, though. Well, all right. Over to you, Sophia. We move ahead. We go to our dear friend. I see because Rachel is not here. Right?
Yeah, she's not. Yeah.
With time, there may be some follow-up questions, but that very much depends on the questions also coming from the audience. So we turn to our dear friend, Julius, who sits in his barrister's chambers in London, a very posh kind of perspective from there. But I guess the main question is similar to that which Gregory had to deal with in relation to how COVID has brought this rather dysfunctionality between the federal government, the governors and the mayors, pulling in different places. Whereas in Africa, we see the centralization of power and the state and coercive measures. In the UK, where there's a devolved model of government, we have seen similar tensions between the devolved administrations in Scotland, in Wales, and in England, plus the fact that I think England takes a large share because they also produce the Prime Minister, when in fact they should be on the same par as the other administrations. So what's your take on this and how COVID has either exacerbated the role of decentralized devolved units and the government of the UK?
Good afternoon, Chaloka. Good afternoon, Sophia. Good afternoon, all the other panelists. I'm delighted to be here today because I've actually learned quite a lot. I thought we were making a duck's dinner out of what is going on in the United Kingdom, but I'm pleased to know that in some other places, things are not getting so well. I would say that in the United Kingdom, for the first time, we see a situation where the people come together and listen to the government for the very, very first time to take instructions as to how to deal with the pandemic. But that was at the very, very beginning, before the tension and the unresolved issues that had been going on through the devolved unit came to the bare open. So as you mentioned earlier, there's England, there is Scotland, there is Wales, and there is Northern Ireland. And if I just go by the number of people who have died in this unit, England had 41,900 people died. Scotland, 18,600 people. Wales, 17,000. Northern Ireland, just under 6,000 people. And there's been a huge competition amongst these units as who is doing what and who is doing the best things. There is also the confusion between them, who is worried about public health as opposed to who is worried about the health of the economy. And I think by the number of deaths, one could have a clue as to who is focusing on what. So Boris Johnson has actually, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has actually promised that there will be a public inquiry as to why we had this big number of people dying and how the whole pandemic has been dealt with. My suspicion is that debate, that inquiry, will turn to a huge debate as to the functionality of the devolved powers and the whole structure, because from the 90s when they were put in place, there had been problems, there had been tensions, and they tend to hide it as they went along. While Prime Minister being in England will always try to give the impression that there was a united kingdom, the united people, united decision-making structure. The other devolved units, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, they have been trying in their own small corners to say, no, we are independent insofar as certain things are concerned. And the COVID-19, which is principally to do with health and education, these two policy areas happen to be devolved as opposed to reserved. So that means that each of the units, they take responsibility for their own health issues and for their own education and other devolved policy issues. You see, Boris Johnson talks about the way to tackle the pandemic. Scotland gets up and says, well, you can do that in England. It's not going to happen here in Scotland because we think we want to do it this way. The slogans were different at some points. Northern Ireland saying, well, we want to carry on in a particular way. And we see from the results, as I read earlier on, the number of people who died leads me to believe that, you know, the person with the lowest number of deaths must have been doing things correctly. So on the 10th of May, when Boris Johnson actually came out first time to talk about how to begin to ease the lockdown that we've been in from March, he spoke and he listed some measures that will apply. But what he did not realize is that most of what he was suggesting could only apply to England and not in Scotland and not to Northern Ireland or Wales. That was a big shame. And in June, recently, when he came out with further measures, he was honest and subdued enough to say that, well, of course, this applies only to England, and the other devolved units should do the things in their own pace as they see fit. So yes, the pandemic has quite clearly exposed this bigger problem, and the situation which had always existed from 2012 when there were changes in the immigration laws in this country had hit the most vulnerable people and immigrants hard. In fact, it was the Tory policy to make for the United Kingdom a hostile environment for immigrants. And from 2012, they came up with the Immigration Act 2012, Immigration Act 2014, Immigration Act 2016, with some very, very draconian laws. For example, you cannot get someone, rent your property if they haven't got a legal right to stay in the United Kingdom. This led to many landlords refusing to let their houses to black people or to minority ethnic people, just in case they didn't have the right documents to be in the country. You cannot drive a car without valid leave to be in the UK. And all these hardship were already existing before all the new laws that came with the Coronavirus Act 2020, which, although on the face of it, I would say it is to tackle the pandemic and so on, but the extra powers that are given to immigration officers, the police officers and so on to detain people who are potentially COVID-19 positive, getting elderly people over 70s to stay at home, getting some disabled people not being able to access services. I think this is absolutely heartbreaking for a country like United Kingdom. I am very disappointed, to say, put it mildly.
Yeah, Sophia has a follow-up question.
Yeah, I think I will alternatively take it on the other side of the coin, the practice side. I know you published recently an article on the ADR, alternative dispute practice, and COVID in relation to human rights, especially on the contractual disputes again. Can you say something about that?
Yes.
So unique about it. Yeah.
So I think one of the good things that government has done, they came up on the 7th of May and actually appealed to people, to potential disputants, to try to resolve their disputes by way of alternative dispute resolution. And I think that is a very, very good thing. As we speak, thousands of people are losing their jobs. Many people are being evicted from their houses. Landlords are losing their properties because they cannot afford the mortgage, and all this chaos. So it leads me to believe that we're going to be swimming in a sea of disputes. Not only that the court system may not be able to handle them because, they'll just be large in numbers, but it will be sensible to try to negotiate to resolve your dispute, to try to go for mediation, to try arbitration. Any other thing that will not get yourself in litigation and in court. And in fact, it's always been in part of the UK law system that you must try to resolve disputes by way of alternative dispute resolution before going to court. The court is normally the last resort when you cannot solve problems by way of alternative dispute resolution. But because of the sheer volume of disputes that are around the corner, it's already happening. I'm encouraging people to try as much as they can to resolve disputes by way of alternative dispute resolution.
If you combine both issues, the devolved units and the tensions, to Cameroon, where you also practice and belong in more ways than one. We have seen the Francophone-Anglophone divide. I think we've been talking about this. How has COVID, what is the impact of COVID on this in terms of exacerbation? But you also do alternative dispute resolution in Cameroon. So how do these two elements of your work sit together in the context of Cameroon?
Well, thank you so much, Chaloka. The problems in Cameroon comes across, and people give so many different interpretations, but what I would say is that there is a problem of governance generally in the country, and it's not specifically whether it's because of Anglophone, but it is true that Anglophones being only 20% have been marginalized for so a long time by the Francophone 80%. But that is slightly beside the point. The fact that some of the Anglophones feel that the only way to resolve the dispute will be to become an independent country is the whole reason why there's all this fighting and all this trouble. But late last year, there was a national dialogue, even though some people say that, well, that has yielded no result or nothing, or no good outcome in terms of stopping the problems. But it happened in any event and came up with so many recommendations. I happen to be one of the vice presidents of one of the committees at the Grand National Dialogue. and we came up with recommendations, which one would have thought by now most of them should have been implemented. And I think that if they had been implemented, I think it might have calmed down things significantly. But again, either it's because of governance or because of COVID-19, the effect of COVID-19, one cannot say. But I know that the excuse has been the effect of COVID-19, which I'm happy to go with that to an extent. But there's one thing that is quite impressive, and it is that in February this year, police forces, the gendarmes and the army went to a village in the northwest region and shot down about 13 people and killed them. So the president, for the first time, ordered for an investigation. So I honestly thought that giving COVID-19 around the corner, he was saying that because he knew COVID-19 will actually hinder that investigation going on. I thought it was just going to be announced and kicked in the long grass. But surprise, surprise, the investigation went on, and the military people, two of them were found to have done wrong, and they were punished accordingly. So I think that's a good news story. But generally, Cameroon has done relatively well, coming out well. I'm not going to talk about the abuses going on, because they are kind of standard in most African countries. So a police officer is arresting somebody for not putting on a face mask, and the officer himself hasn't got one on, and is arresting somebody for not having one on and asking them to pay on the spot fine. Those are the human rights things that one could pick out. There's been allegations and counter-allegations from the opposition party and the government that the government is hindering opposition's effort to help, which, if it's true, it is a very sad and unfortunate situation. The government, on the other hand, is saying that the opposition is using the opportunity to raise funds for political agendas and so on. And so the government passed a law that fundraising was prohibited. You can only do that with the express authority of the Minister of Territorial Administration, which I think that is a bit crazy, but that is the situation.
Well, thank you very much for that. I mean, you've made huge points. The UK instructions first, but the more mixed messages came out, and the more the messages were different between all the devolved units. I think people were no longer taking instructions, as it were, and took matters in their own hands. And I think the pandemic has strengthened the hand of the devolved units. So the United Kingdom, that kind of buried them in the United Kingdom, is now actually split in terms of the visibility of the devolved units. So the United Kingdom perhaps will not be the same again because of COVID. But without taking so much time, I now turn to the host in her official capacity as the host to lead the discussion on any questions from the public or from anywhere. But if we have to turn back the discussion, I would just like us to think about where Julius ended, which is the impact of COVID on governance vis-a-vis freedom of political organization, political parties, ruling parties, elections or not, whether elections should be cancelled. This debate is going on in the background. I think the African Court of Justice has actually received a request for an advisory opinion on elections and COVID. So we can hold those in the parking lot. And if there are no questions from the audience to deal with, perhaps we can come back and reflect on that question, because it is a huge one. Please, our host.
Thank you. Thank you, Chaloka. Actually, I want to say something about the status of election in Ethiopia, if you allow me, when we get back to that.
Sure.
In any case, so there are a few questions from the audience, and I will filter them. And let's see, this one says, lately there has been a lot of talk on facial recognition and its controversy. I know a lot in the United States, and that it should be a human rights issue, etc. So do you believe, any of the panelists, I will leave it to that this should be considered a human rights issue? It's been very, very controversial in terms of discrimination, particularly. So what's anyone's thought about that?
Well, I would say that for law enforcement, it's been a big boon in being able to find suspects and what they call on television perpetrators. But it can be misused, certainly. We in the United States now have a big controversy over the body cams that police are mandated to wear. And the police are saying it makes their jobs harder. Actually, I consider it protection, because if in fact they follow procedures, the body cam is supposed to show that. In today's modern world, there are cameras everywhere. And the idea that if you're outside your house, that your home, that there's an expectation of privacy, I think that's a fantasy. We're way beyond that now. There are cameras in front of stores, inside stores, in parking lots, all over. And it can be a big help, but it also can be abused. So in terms of human rights, I would say the expectation that we would go backward in time and not use these is unrealistic. But we need to be, and we need our lawyers and our legislators to be very, very careful in coming up with guidelines to prevent abuse to the extent possible.
Well, there was a judgment in the UK just this week. It's the Court of Appeal judgment that actually found that this whole issue of facial recognition was an abuse of human rights and privacy without due safeguards. I mean, they struck a balance between the importance and necessity of doing that, but also of the lack of safeguards, as well as abuse on the part of the police in this particular case. I think it was fairly well reported. I have a copy downstairs, but I don't think it's necessary. Those in the audience, I think, who raised that issue can Google up that case and, Court of Appeal decision on facial recognition in the UK. It will come up.
Anywhere in Africa? I don't know if we use facial recognition systems, unless, of course, we're considering the cameras and all that as part of facial recognition.
Well, each time I use my phone, which has Face ID, so it can recognize me. Yeah. But if I'm wearing a mask, it can't. So there's an issue about facial recognition and masks that people can perhaps address in their response. And I'm just throwing this as a kind of light-hearted moment.
True. Okay, there's another one on social media. So social media networks usually give advertisers private information of users without user consent. We know that. So does social media violate human rights? What is the panel thought on, and how can social media networks handle the issue better to avoid violation of people's right to privacy?
Well, I mean, this is a very important issue, but I mean, nobody can have an answer to it now. There has been a surveillance application, though, in Qatar that was released. It's called Ihtiraz, that was released post-COVID, I think in May. And Amnesty International, together with the Human Rights Watch, issued a statement saying that this really violates the rights of the people, because in case you leave home, in terms of the COVID, you need to be always watched out. And so this was before the opening and the easing up of the restrictions. However, social media has always, the Facebook, Twitter, and especially Facebook, I mean, and other tools they've been always accused of violating this personal and private space and being used. And we know a lot of incidents in that. They say they're trying. They say they are trying their best not to do so. But I mean, any one of us know how far they can go and how far the information, if leaked, can affect our personal lives. If an application like Notably of the kids, the Notably was actually created and invented to at least protect babies and kids and the pictures of babies and kids, since they did not give consent to their parents to put their pictures on Facebook. I'm not sure if we can all turn into the Notably Kids application and go on it to protect our personal lives. But this will take us to the point which we always think about. I mean, we need to protect our privacy and we need to stay safe, but we still need to live. And to live, we need to communicate and to have social communication, and we can't live isolated. I mean, forever. You know, there's always something that you give. Yeah, there's always something that you give. And actually, with COVID, we had the time to look more into our feelings towards during isolation. You know, looking into our fragilities and weaknesses, and think of how to stay safe, but also not to lose life, the essence of life. And of course, social media is a big part of our lives now.
We need to communicate, especially with social media now more than ever.
Yeah. But fairly shortly, there was a decision by the European Court of Human Rights, Big Brother versus the United Kingdom, which implicates social media as well. But it involved the laws that the UK had passed, so they could keep data and monitor sites on the internet that people had visited much more, and keeping those. And the European Court of Human Rights said that this was clearly unlawful, a breach. There are no safeguards. The problem with the social media, well, that affects the social media as well. But even if you give your consent, beyond your consent, you have no control over that data, what they use it for. And data now, information about people has become big business. Elections, you know, Facebook profiles, interests, and everything else. So it's, it's a big issue.
So very hard to build consensus between the three structures, the business, the governments, the individual governments, and then the human rights body, the bigger one. So different views, different applications, different objectives and agendas. Very hard to reconcile us.
So, Sophia,
Sophia was going to say something.
I see social media as a two-edged sword, because in Africa, for example, it was very useful in Zimbabwe, in Egypt, Tunisia, in people organizing themselves to protest the excesses of government. But on the other hand, people that we call trolls misuse the social media on Twitter and Facebook to criticize people, to bully people, and to spread malicious rumors. In the United States, I think it was Chicago, I may be incorrect, but there was a rumor that police shot an unarmed 15-year-old.
Yeah.
And we talked about the body cam. When the body cam footage was released, it showed that the young man was shooting at police, and police shot back, and that's how he was shot. So that dispelled the rumor and cut off the violence, but the violence had already started because of an incorrect rumor. So, you know, the misuse of social media, quite apart from the heavy hand of the government in regulating it, is very dangerous. Because on Twitter, what you think right at the moment, you can say, and it can have a big impact. And if you thought about it, maybe you would think, I shouldn't have said that. So I think we all know people who do such things.
Exactly.
And I believe that that it has gotten more than one person in trouble being intemperate. So it's not just the government, it's also the public that causes this to be dangerous.
Well, if I just may say that you can also look at it from the point of view of the government of individual government, but also individuals and the owners of the various social media platforms. Now, if you think about the human rights laws, these laws should have some kind of big intergovernmental applicability, but each government should interpret it the way that suits them. There can be some inconsistencies, but abuse of the social media sometimes can be punished by a different law in the country. I'm just thinking on top of my head, a very senior police officer was prosecuted here for having a video of sexual abuse of a child in her phone. She had not even viewed it. She didn't even view it. It was just sent to her by her sister. And when her phone was taken from her and went through, that video was there. So she lost her job and she was prosecuted for that. So that is how one way of dealing with the abuse of social media. But I think I just finished with this one point from that Gregory made earlier on about the guidelines, you know, how the government should be able to pass laws to protect the abuse of social media by making great laws and great guidelines. I'll go one step to add that, but not only making them, but enforcing them. Because if you go to, you know, the legal libraries of many countries and so on, they have all sorts of laws there from 19 whatever. But it's applying them that, you know, is a problem. And because they don't apply them, the things just go pear-shaped. But I'm 100% for social media. I mean, we don't have a choice anyway. It is there, it's going. Whether we like it or not, it is there, it's going. It's how we manage it to reduce the negative impact that it brings to our society.
Well, so from my side, I think in the interest of time, we're finished with the questions from the, at least, audience. So if you want to wrap it up.
We come back to that big question. You said you two had some observations to make.
Well, the only thing I wanted to add with what Julius was saying about governance and elections and so forth, and you know, just like in Cameroon, that the government is delaying issues of human rights, addressing all these things that are coming as a result of COVID-19. Ethiopia did the same thing. I mean, I'm from Ethiopia, so I keep remotely in touch, and there were supposed to be election in June, July. Now it's delayed, and the current prime minister has moved in at his own liberty, so it's considered unconstitutional what he's doing, and violation of human rights. So I think a lot of times, even I think in the US, there was an attempt to do that, but with those big parties and strong parties, they couldn't be. But you know, governments would always use a crisis to exert their authorities over what they want to do. So this is the election cases are one of them.
Any other view? Evans, Gregory?
Yeah. Let me say that one of the issues that has come up as a result of the COVID-19 in most countries is the corruption that Sophia spoke about earlier in relation to the funds that have been provided to contain the pandemic.
Yeah.
In Kenya, we have got 47 developed units that have taken funds from central government, and the accountability issue is going to arise as we move ahead. In fact, as we speak, there are already criminal prosecutions going on, and not only in Kenya but elsewhere with regard to these funds. So we will just be on the lookout, because it is during periods like this that people take advantage of the situation. But because I don't think I'll have another chance to speak, let me just put it this way. We do need positive transformation. This is definitely inevitable. We must ensure that Africa's next normal is characterized by inclusive development, effective delivery of services, and innovative approaches to solve the situations that we are in now. we cannot fail, we can only succeed.
Fantastic.
Gregory, closing remarks?
Only that I want to thank you for organizing this and for putting together such a distinguished panel who has a breadth of experience on all these issues. Governance in Africa has long been a concern of many of us, and COVID only exacerbates existing problems. At USAID, we're looking toward the future, toward how to help African governments to stabilize their economies, the political situation, and the social situation. It isn't going to be easy, but we all have to look toward the future because this has been a game changer for the entire world. So again, I thank my fellow panelists and for the organizers and the moderators of this discussion.
Thank you. Camilla?
I mean, as a media person, I wish that amidst all of these sensitivities going on and amidst the control that's exerted from so many different institutions and authorities, not only in Egypt but elsewhere, it's a big challenge for media and for journalists, as much as it is a big challenge for the medical teams as well, who were arrested in so many places for complaining from shortages of equipment or complaining for certain rights that they miss. So I really wish that amidst this we can be able to document this moment. And through different means, this is going to be, I mean, we're all writing history at the moment that will last for the upcoming generations. And looking back to the past, during the times of the cholera and the Spanish flu and so forth, end of the day, you just have the pictures, the testimonies of the people, the testimonies of the medical staff, and how the governments were able and the rulers were able to make decisions, the right decisions or the wrong decisions. So I just hope that we can get out of this this phase, which will take quite a long time, with enough that can help the future of the coming generations. And of course, with what can also help us in terms of feeling alive, not just safe, as I said before.
Thank you. Sophia, later pen, closing remarks, thoughts?
Thank you very much to my namesake for inviting me here. And to you as well for moderating this panel, and to all the moderators. This has been such a wonderful discussion. I'm looking forward to the next one, and also discussing some of the very practical measures that we can take to move this conversation forward. As everybody has noticed, COVID-19 has been an accelerant. So how can it be an accelerant to positive change, whether it's in governance, whether it's in human rights accountability? How do we actually then use this opportunity to work on those systemic inequalities, to work on systemic issues concerning governance and so on and so forth. So I really thank you for the opportunity, and I can't wait for more. I always love to be in the presence of my seniors. I learn a lot. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Julius, can you take us across the sprint line?
Well, thank you. I just can only endorse everything that the other panelists have said by way of my closing remarks. I think they've said it all. It's fantastic. Evans is absolutely spot on. The funding that countries are receiving in Africa, they are just stealing as they go along. In Cameroon, for example, the Prime Minister has ordered for an inquiry as to how some chunk of money has dissipated in the thin air. And yes, Gregory is absolutely right. We should be looking forward, even though it breaks my heart sometimes when a president gets out of the blue and says, oh, there was an error in his birth certificate, He's actually 10 years younger than what we've always known. Talk less about him standing again for elections and wanting to have another term to rule, even though they've got such a disgusting record in terms of human rights abuse. You guys have done a fantastic job, Sophia and Chaloka, to take us through this very exciting session from which I've learned very much, and I'm grateful to you all.
Thank you. And now finally handing over back to our host to host us all and take us to closure.
Okay, thank you, Chaloka. Well, it seems like Africa has even more daunting challenge than our last virtual session on SMEs, which was very interesting to hear. So based on your various views and experiences you've shared here with us, it seems like all sectors also have to come together to move the Africa agenda forward in order to come out of this. Certainly not business as usual. Africa is, on the other hand, is resilient continent. We have gone through much worse things before. So we will just keep faith alive and work hard towards our sustainable goals. That's all we can do. And so thank you all for this great conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been very generous with your time and thoughts on the topic. We've learned a lot from you. Our audience will celebrate your thoughts. Human rights issue, you know, even for me, I was trying to understand what the governance, I know governance, but what was the human right aspect of it. And when I was preparing for this, I learned that it just applies to all of us. It's the way it's kind of packaged that it's become a module of its own. Let us please be in touch. And Greg, have a wonderful day of anniversary today. And yes, please send apologies to your wife. I wish all of you good luck in enduring the storm and helping this governance and human rights agenda of Africa forward, which affects all of us. You can find this recording, of course, on our website, and we will send it via email as well when we're finished. Once again, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. Good day to all of you. We now adjourn the meeting. Thank you so much.
Camilla Ismail is the creator, director, and producer of the self-filmed Camilla Stories. As she spoke earlier on the panel, she sent us the link to her recent documentary on the right on COVID-19 titled Normal versus Neo-Normal Fear. This documentary is subtitled in English, and you can also find the link in the video description on YouTube. We have come to the end of our fourth crisis management conversation series on governance and human rights in the era of COVID-19. The recordings, both video and podcast audio, are available on our web forum site at www.webforum.dotconnectafrica.org. We thank our DCA Academy for sponsoring our web forum and our partners for their support. Stay safe, share and keep connected, and together we will overcome.